What if I told you that the greatest empire in history began on a rain-soaked island in the North Atlantic, a place smaller than the state of Michigan, battered by storms, and inhabited by tribes who were more interested in fighting each other than ruling the world? Yet from these unpromising beginnings, Britain would one day control a quarter of the earth, an empire so vast that the sun literally never set on its lands. But to understand the rise of the British Empire, we have to roll the clock all the way back, centuries before Queen Victoria, the East India Company, or the Industrial Revolution, to a time when England wasn't even England yet. Let's rewind to the year 1066. Britain at this point isn't a single nation, it's a patchwork of rival kingdoms, Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, all fighting off wave after wave of invaders. Romans came first, leaving behind Rhodes, Baths, and the ghostly outline of Hadrian's Wall. Then came the Saxons and the Vikings, whose longships terrorized the coasts. But in 1066, something happens that will completely reshape the destiny of this island: the Norman conquest. William the Conqueror, the Duke of Normandy in what's now northern France, invades with his knights and defeats King Harold at the Battle of Hastings. Suddenly, the English elite are replaced by Normans, who bring with them a new language, a new aristocracy, and a new way of thinking about power. This moment matters because it lays the groundwork for everything that follows. The Normans didn't just take over, they centralized authority. They built castles, cathedrals, and a system of feudalism that gave the king far greater control than before. And, crucially, they began looking outward. You see, the Normans were not farmers content to till the soil. They were warriors and builders with ambitions beyond their shores. Within decades, Norman knights were sailing across the Irish Sea, conquering parts of Ireland. Others joined the Crusades, fighting in the Middle East. This mindset of expansion, of looking beyond the island, became part of England's DNA. It's the seed of empire. For the next few centuries, England is caught up in power struggles with France, Scotland, and Wales. Kings like Edward I and Edward III wage long campaigns that drain the treasury but also sharpen England's military edge. The Hundred Years' War against France, 1337 to 1453, is brutal, costly, and ultimately unsuccessful, but it teaches the English something important. Controlling territory overseas is hard, but trade, that's where real power lies. Even before Columbus stumbles across the Americas, English merchants are probing trade routes into the Baltic, Russia, and the Mediterranean. The appetite for overseas opportunity is growing. By the late 1400s, the Renaissance is transforming Europe. Knowledge, science, and navigation explode. Across the continent, kingdoms are racing to explore new worlds. Spain and Portugal surge ahead, launching voyages to Africa, India, and the Americas. Columbus sails west in 1492 and accidentally discovers the New World, flooding Spain with unimaginable riches: gold, silver, and new crops like potatoes and tobacco. England, still a second-rate power at this point, looks on enviously. The Spanish and Portuguese are carving up the globe, and the English want a peace. Enter the Tudors, and especially Queen Elizabeth I. Under her reign in the late 1500s, England takes its first real steps toward empire. But it doesn't begin with colonies or conquests, it begins with piracy. Elizabeth gives her blessing to men like Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh, privateers who are essentially government-sponsored pirates. Their mission? Harass Spanish treasure ships, steal gold and silver, and bring it back to England. Drake becomes a national hero after circumnavigating the globe and plundering Spanish holdings, while Raleigh sets his sights on planting colonies in the New World. Most of these early attempts, like the mysterious Roanoke colony, fail spectacularly, but the ambition is there. The dream of empire has been born. And here's the irony. England's weakness is what drives its success. Unlike Spain, with its endless silver mines in South America, England has to be scrappy. It doesn't have vast resources to rely on, so it innovates. It develops stronger ships, smarter trade networks, and an obsession with the sea. England is transforming from a medieval backwater into a seafaring nation ready to challenge the great powers of Europe. So, in this first stage of the story, the British Empire doesn't look anything like the global superpower it will become. It's fragile, experimental, and driven by sheer opportunism. But the DNA of empire is already forming. The Norman hunger for expansion, the Tudor daring on the seas, and the realization that trade and naval power will be the keys to global influence. The empire hasn't yet begun, but the fuse has been lit. When people imagine the British Empire, they often picture red-coated soldiers marching across India or Union Jacks flying proudly over Africa. But the empire didn't begin with armies or flags. It began with merchants, pirates, and a queen who realized that gold could be just as powerful as gunpowder. By the end of the 1500s, Queen Elizabeth I had turned England from a vulnerable island kingdom into a rising naval power. Her privateers, like Francis Drake, didn't just rob Spanish ships, they humiliated Spain, the superpower of the age. In 1588, England won one of its most legendary victories, the defeat of the Spanish Armada. Against all odds, the invincible Spanish fleet was scattered by English firepower and brutal storms. That single event didn't just protect England from invasion, it announced to the world that this scrappy island nation was now a serious contender on the global stage. But Elizabeth was smart enough to see that piracy wasn't a long-term strategy. You can't build an empire just by stealing treasure from your rivals. Eventually, you need your own sources of wealth. So England began experimenting with a new model: overseas trading companies. These weren't just businesses, they were hybrids. Part corporation, part military, part colonial government. The East India Company, founded in 1600, was the most important of them all. Granted a royal charter by Elizabeth, it had the exclusive right to trade east of the Cape of Good Hope. That meant spices, silk, tea, cotton, and anything else valuable that Europe craved. But the company's power went far beyond trade. It could raise its own armies, build forts, sign treaties, and essentially operate as a private empire in the name of the crown. Think of it as Amazon, NATO, and the CIA all rolled into one. At first, the East India Company was just a collection of merchants trying to compete with the mighty Dutch and Portuguese trading networks. But as the 1600s rolled on, it grew bolder. It established factories, fortified trading posts in key Indian cities like Surat, Madras, and Calcutta. Over time, those outposts became miniature kingdoms, with company soldiers guarding warehouses and dictating terms to local rulers. The age of corporate imperialism had begun. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, England was trying something even more daring: colonization. In 1607, the Virginia Company, another joint stock venture, established Jamestown, the first permanent English settlement in North America. It was a brutal experiment. Disease, starvation, and conflict with local indigenous peoples nearly wiped the colony out. At one point, desperate colonists reportedly resorted to cannibalism. But against the odds, Jamestown survived. And when tobacco cultivation took off, it thrived. This was a turning point. Unlike the Spanish, who focused on extracting gold and silver, the English built colonies designed to last. They brought families, built towns, and created new societies. The New World wasn't just a source of treasure, it was a place to settle, grow crops, and expand permanently. Soon, more colonies followed. Plymouth in 1620, Massachusetts Bay in 1630, Maryland, the Carolinas, and beyond. Each one was a gamble, but together they planted the seeds of a new transatlantic empire. Still, England's early empire wasn't all about peaceful trade and pioneering settlers. the darker side of expansion was already taking shape. English ships became deeply involved in the Atlantic slave trade, transporting enslaved Africans to work on sugar plantations in the Caribbean. Colonies like Barbados and Jamaica were built on this brutal system where unimaginable profits for England came at the expense of human suffering on an industrial scale. By the mid-1600s, sugar was called white gold, and it fueled both Britain's economy and its empire. The 17th century was chaotic for England at home as well. Civil war broke out in the 1640s. King Charles I was executed, and for a time England was even a republic under Oliver Cromwell. But even during this domestic turmoil, overseas ambitions never stopped. In fact, Cromwell aggressively pushed England's naval power, capturing Jamaica from Spain in 1655 and expanding trade across the Atlantic. By the time the monarchy was restored in 1660 under Charles II, England had established itself as a rising imperial power. Rivalries with the Dutch led to naval wars, while the Royal African Company expanded England's grip on the slave trade. Colonies in North America and the Caribbean grew rapidly, fueled by enslaved labor and the insatiable demand for sugar, tobacco, and rum. It's worth pausing here to notice something crucial. The empire wasn't being built by careful planning from London. It was messy, improvised, and often chaotic. Merchants, adventurers, settlers, and soldiers pushed outward while the crown tried to keep up. Sometimes colonies succeeded, sometimes they failed, but over time a patchwork of English possessions began to stretch across the globe. By the late 1600s, the English had outposts in North America, the Caribbean, West Africa, and India. The dream of empire was no longer just talk, it was a reality. And while no one could yet imagine the global powerhouse Britain would become, the foundations had been laid. A tiny island nation had started to weave its influence across oceans, carried by ships, driven by trade, and fueled by an insatiable hunger for profit. The age of piracy was fading. The age of empire had begun. By the dawn of the 18th century, England had transformed from a pirate-backed underdog into a serious player in global trade. But it wasn't just England anymore. In 1707, the Act of Union joined England and Scotland into a single kingdom, Great Britain. This new United Kingdom had greater resources, more manpower, and a shared drive to expand overseas. The British Empire was entering its next phase. The early 1700s were a time of intense rivalry. The Dutch, once England's biggest competitors, were fading as a naval power. The real enemy now was France. France was bigger, richer, and more populous than Britain, with powerful armies on the continent and ambitions overseas. If Britain wanted to rise, it had to break French dominance. At first, Britain's empire in the Americas and Asia was still fragile. Colonies on the eastern seaboard of North America were growing, but they were constantly threatened by both indigenous nations and French settlers to the north in Canada. In India, the East India Company had trading posts, but France also had its own East India Company, and both were angling for influence with local rulers. The Caribbean islands, with their sugar wealth, were another battleground. Everywhere Britain turned, France was there. This competition exploded into full-scale conflict in the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763. Some historians call it the First True World War. Fighting raged not just in Europe, but in North America, the Caribbean, West Africa, and India. Britain allied with Prussia, while France teamed up with Austria, Spain, and Russia. The result was a globe-spanning struggle that would decide the fate of empires. In North America, this conflict is often remembered as the French and Indian War. British colonists and troops fought alongside indigenous allies against French forces and their Native American partners. The fighting was brutal. Massacres, scorched earth campaigns, and bloody frontier skirmishes defined the war. But Britain eventually gained the upper hand. Key victories like the capture of Quebec in 1759 effectively ended French power in Canada. By the Treaty of Paris in 1763, France ceded almost all of its North American territories. Britain now controlled Canada and the lands east of the Mississippi River. In India, the East India Company was proving just how dangerous a corporate army could be. At the Battle of Plassey in 1757, Robert Clive and company troops with local allies defeated the Nawab of Bengal and his French supporters. This wasn't just a battlefield win. It opened the door for Britain to dominate one of the richest provinces in India. With Bengal under their control, the East India Company had access to immense resources, revenues, and manpower. It was the beginning of British supremacy in South Asia. In the Caribbean, Britain captured key French islands like Guadeloupe and Martinique, though many were later returned in the peace settlement. More importantly, Britain seized Spanish Havana and Manila for a time, demonstrating the global reach of its navy. The Royal Navy had become the decisive factor in the war. Wherever the British fleet sailed, it disrupted enemy trade, cut supply lines, and supported land conquests. By 1763, Britain had established itself as the world's dominant naval power, a status it would hold for more than a century. But victory came at a cost. The war nearly bankrupted the British government, maintaining armies across continents, supplying fleets, and subsidizing allies drained the treasury. Britain emerged with vast new territories, but also staggering debts. And here lies one of history's greatest ironies. To pay for their victory, the British government turned to taxing their own colonies, and that decision would light the fuse for revolution. In the American colonies, settlers had fought alongside British troops, but they weren't given a voice in how the new territories would be managed. Worse, when Parliament imposed new taxes like the Stamp Act and the Tea Act to cover war costs, colonists exploded in protest. Their rallying cry, "No taxation without representation," challenged the very authority of the empire. The Boston Tea Party of 1773 and the escalating clashes that followed showed that Britain's first great imperial triumph was already sowing the seeds of disaster. Back in India, the East India Company's rapid expansion brought both incredible profits and serious corruption. Company officials grew rich beyond belief, while Bengal itself suffered exploitation and famine. Britain was discovering that conquering territory was one thing, governing it was another. Still, in the 1760s, it seemed as if Britain had everything. Canada, India, the Caribbean, a navy that ruled the seas. This was the first true British world empire. No other power had colonies and influence spread across so many continents. The phrase, "the sun never sets on the British Empire," was beginning to feel real. Yet empires have a way of overreaching. Just as Britain reached this high point, challenges were brewing on both sides of the Atlantic. In North America, colonists were preparing to fight for independence. In India, the East India Company was digging deeper into politics and war. The 18th century was far from over, and Britain's empire was about to face its first great crisis. By the 1760s, Britain stood at the pinnacle of global power. The 7 Years' War had given it Canada, vast influence in India, and dominance over the world's seas. For the first time in history, a single nation could claim to be a global superpower, but empires often collapse from within as quickly as they rise, and Britain was about to discover that the price of victory could be devastating. The problem lay in North America. The British colonies along the Atlantic seaboard had grown from fragile settlements into thriving societies of more than 2 million people. They traded, farmed, and built towns with a degree of independence that colonists had grown accustomed to. But after the 7 Years' War, London expected them to contribute more to the costs of empire. Parliament imposed new taxes: the Stamp Act of 1765, the Townshend Duties of 1767, and eventually the Tea Act of 1773. To British officials, this made perfect sense. The war to defend the colonies had nearly bankrupted Britain, but to the colonists, it was an outrage. They had no representatives in Parliament, and they insisted on the principle of no taxation without representation. The protests quickly escalated. In Boston, mobs attacked tax collectors, pamphleteers spread revolutionary ideas, and in December 1773, angry colonists dumped an entire shipment of British tea into the harbour in what became the legendary Boston Tea Party. The British government responded with harsh measures, sending troops and trying to clamp down on dissent. But the harder Britain pushed, the more determined the colonists became. By 1775, open conflict had broken out at Lexington and Concord, and within a year the colonies declared independence as the United States of America. What began as a protest over taxes had transformed into a full-blown revolution. For Britain, the American Revolution was more than just a rebellion, it was a humiliation. This wasn't some distant territory, these were Britain's own people, English-speaking settlers who shared the same culture. Losing them was both a political disaster and a psychological blow. After years of bitter fighting, capped by the decisive American victory at Yorktown in 1781, Britain finally recognized American independence in the Treaty of Paris in 1783. At first, it looked as though the empire had been fatally wounded. Britain's most valuable colonies, the 13 American states, were gone. Some in Europe believed Britain's imperial experiment was finished, but empires don't collapse overnight, and Britain, far from retreating, simply looked elsewhere. Only 5 years after losing America, Britain began a bold new venture, colonizing Australia. In 1788, the first fleet of 11 ships arrived in Botany Bay, carrying around 700 convicts along with marines and officials. Australia was to be a penal colony, a place to dump Britain's overflowing prisons now that America was closed off. Conditions were harsh, supplies often ran short, and relations with Indigenous Australians were tense and violent. But just as Jamestown had survived against the odds, the settlement in New South Wales endured. Over the decades, more ships arrived, more convicts were transported, and eventually free settlers followed. From these rough beginnings, an entire continent would be brought under British control. At the same time, Britain tightened its grip on India, which was fast becoming the crown jewel of the empire. The East India Company, already enriched by the conquest of Bengal, continued to expand its influence through military campaigns, alliances with local rulers, and ruthless economic exploitation. By the late 1700s, the company wasn't just trading, it was governing millions of people. Its private army was larger than many European national armies. But company rule also brought disasters. The Great Bengal Famine of 1770 killed millions, partly due to company policies that prioritized profits over people. Corruption among company officials became a scandal back in Britain. Parliament began to take notice, passing acts to regulate the company and asserting more direct control. It was clear that India would shape the future of the British Empire, but whether that future would be stable was another question entirely. Meanwhile, Britain was building power in the Caribbean as well. Despite losing America, colonies like Jamaica, Barbados, and Trinidad remained enormously profitable thanks to sugar plantations. These plantations, worked by enslaved Africans, generated fortunes for British merchants and fueled the transatlantic economy of sugar, rum, and slaves. The brutality of the system was staggering, but it made Britain rich and gave it the resources to continue projecting power worldwide. By the end of the 18th century, Britain had lost one empire but was already constructing another. America was gone, but in its place stood a patchwork of territories stretching from India to the Caribbean to Australia. And a new force was emerging at home that would supercharge Britain's imperial ambitions, the Industrial Revolution. Steam engines, mechanized factories, and advances in shipbuilding were about to transform Britain into the workshop of the world. So while the American Revolution was a bitter defeat, it didn't end the story of the British Empire. In many ways, it was just the beginning. The loss forced Britain to pivot, innovate, and seek new horizons. And those horizons, in India, in Australia, in Africa, and beyond, would soon carry the empire to its golden age. If the 18th century was about trial and error, the 19th century would be about dominance. By the early 1800s, Britain had taken the lessons of colonialism, combined them with new technology, and transformed itself into something the world had never seen before, the first truly industrial empire. The Industrial Revolution, which began in Britain in the mid-1700s, was the secret weapon behind this transformation. Suddenly, Britain wasn't just competing on the same playing field as other European powers, it was inventing a new game entirely. Steam engines powered factories, spinning jennies and mechanical looms revolutionized textile production, and coal fueled everything from locomotives to ironworks. British factories churned out goods on a scale no rival could match, and its growing population provided both labour and markets. This industrial might had a direct impact on empire. Mass production meant cheaper goods, which Britain could flood into colonial markets. Cotton grown in India or the American South was shipped to Manchester, woven into cloth and then sold around the world, sometimes even back to the very places where the raw cotton had been grown. Empire and industry became a feedback loop. Colonies supplied raw materials, British factories turned them into finished products, and the empire absorbed those products in return. But technology wasn't just changing the economy, it was reshaping warfare and logistics. The Royal Navy, already the world's most powerful fleet, now had access to stronger ships built with industrial ironworks, better cannons, and eventually steam propulsion. This naval supremacy allowed Britain to move troops, defend trade routes, and strike anywhere on the globe. In the age of sail and steam, Britannia truly ruled the waves. This advantage was put to the test in the Napoleonic Wars, 1803 to 1815. When revolutionary France transformed into Napoleon Bonaparte's empire, Britain found itself locked in a titanic struggle for survival. On land, Britain was no match for Napoleon's armies, which dominated continental Europe. But at sea, Britain reigned supreme. The Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, where Admiral Nelson destroyed the combined French and Spanish fleets, guaranteed that Napoleon could never invade Britain. From that moment on, Britain controlled the world's oceans. Naval dominance allowed Britain to blockade France, choke its trade, and expand its empire while Napoleon fought in Europe. During the wars, Britain captured colonies from France, Spain, and the Netherlands, strategically valuable outposts like the Cape Colony in South Africa, Mauritius in the Indian Ocean, and parts of the Caribbean. By the time Napoleon was finally defeated at Waterloo in 1815, Britain had not only survived, but had expanded its global reach dramatically. The end of the Napoleonic Wars ushered in what historians often call the Pax Britannica, a century of relative peace in which Britain acted as the world's policeman. With France defeated, Spain declining, and the Dutch sidelined, Britain was left without a serious European naval rival. Its navy could patrol global trade routes, suppress piracy, and enforce British interests from the Caribbean to the South China Sea. But this dominance came with contradictions. In 1807, Britain abolished the transatlantic slave trade, and in 1833, slavery itself was abolished throughout the empire. This was a moral turning point, but also a strategic one. The Royal Navy, once deeply complicit in transporting enslaved Africans, now patrolled the coasts of Africa to suppress the trade. Britain cast itself as a champion of freedom, even as it continued to exploit millions of colonial subjects through economic systems that were little better than slavery in disguise. Meanwhile, Britain's industrial strength continued to grow. Railways crisscrossed the country, steamships cut travel times across the Atlantic, and telegraph cables began shrinking communication across continents. The empire was no longer held together only by ships and soldiers. It was being stitched into a single global system by steel, wires, and steam. This was also the period when Britain began projecting soft power alongside military might. Missionaries spread Christianity, reformers pushed British-style education, and administrators exported the English legal system. From schools in India to parliaments in Canada, Britain was exporting not just goods but ideas. Some of these ideas, democracy, law, free trade, would later be used against the empire itself, but in the 19th century they gave Britain a sense of moral superiority. Still, beneath the surface, tensions were brewing. The Industrial Revolution made Britain rich, but it also created deep inequalities both at home and abroad. Factory workers in Manchester or Birmingham lived in grim conditions, while colonial subjects in India, Africa, and the Caribbean faced famine, exploitation, and heavy-handed rule. The empire might have looked like a golden machine of progress, but its gears were greased with suffering. By the mid-19th century, Britain stood as the unrivaled global power. Its empire stretched from Canada to India, from Australia to the Caribbean, and from Africa to the Pacific. The pound sterling was the world's reserve currency, the Royal Navy was unmatched, and London was the beating heart of global finance. For the first time in history, one nation seemed capable of shaping the destiny of the entire world. But supremacy invites challenge. Other nations were watching, learning, and industrializing too. And Britain's moral contradictions, abolition on one hand, exploitation on the other, were beginning to create cracks in the imperial facade. The workshop of the world had built the mightiest empire ever known, but how long could it keep it? By the mid-19th century, Britain was no longer just another European power. It was the center of a global system. With Napoleon defeated and rivals lagging behind, Britain used its industrial might and naval supremacy to build an empire of unprecedented scale. Nowhere was this more visible than in India, which became both the pride and the burden of British imperial ambition. For nearly a century, the East India Company had acted as Britain's proxy in India, running territories, collecting taxes, and commanding a vast private army. But company rule was plagued by corruption, famine, and resentment. These tensions exploded in 1857 in what the British called the Sepoy Mutiny and Indians remember as the First War of Independence. Sparked by anger over cultural and religious insensitivity, including rifle cartridges rumoured to be greased with cow and pig fat, the uprising spread across northern India. It was a bloody conflict. Both sides committed atrocities and entire cities were destroyed. After months of brutal fighting, the rebellion was crushed, but it changed everything. The British government decided the East India Company could no longer be trusted with such responsibility. In 1858, the company was dissolved, and India came under direct rule of the British Crown. Queen Victoria was declared Empress of India, and the subcontinent was formally absorbed into the empire. India became the crown jewel of Britain's empire. Its vast population, agricultural wealth, and strategic location made it indispensable. Railways were laid across the country, telegraphs installed, and ports modernized. To the British, these projects represented progress and civilization. To many Indians, they looked like tools of control. Cotton, tea, and opium flowed out of India, enriching Britain, while Indian industries, especially textiles, were suppressed to prevent competition with Manchester mills. The contradictions were striking. Britain built universities, courts, and railroads in India, while at the same time imposing heavy taxes, exploiting resources, and maintaining strict racial hierarchies. Some Indians embraced British education and ideas of democracy, sowing the seeds of future independence movements. Others saw only oppression. The empire was binding India closer than ever, but also planting the roots of resistance. While India was central, Britain's imperial gaze reached further east. In China, Britain's hunger for profit created one of the most infamous chapters of empire, the Opium Wars. British merchants, frustrated by Chinese restrictions on trade, discovered that smuggling Indian opium into China was enormously lucrative. Millions of Chinese became addicted, and when the Qing government tried to crack down, Britain responded with force. In the First Opium War, 1839 to 1842, the Royal Navy's superior firepower overwhelmed Chinese defences. The resulting Treaty of Nanking forced China to open ports to British trade, cede Hong Kong, and grant most favoured nation status to Britain. A second war in the 1850s brought even more humiliating concessions. The so-called century of humiliation for China had begun, and Britain was at its centre. Back home, the empire became a source of national pride. Queen Victoria, reigning from 1837 to 1901, came to symbolise the imperial age. Her image was stamped on coins from Canada to Australia to India. The Victorians saw empire as both a duty and a destiny. Missionaries spread Christianity, explorers mapped Africa, and writers celebrated the idea of a civilizing mission. The phrase, "the white man's burden," would later capture this paternalistic ideology, the belief that Britain was uplifting the world even as it exploited it. The empire also reshaped British society itself. Tea from India and Ceylon became a national staple. Sugar from the Caribbean sweetened working-class diets. Exotic goods, spices, cotton, porcelain filled British homes. London grew into the financial hub of the world, with banks, insurance firms and trading companies all fueled by imperial wealth. The empire wasn't just overseas, it was part of daily life in Britain. Yet the empire's wealth was built on deep inequalities. Famines in India killed millions in the 19th century, often worsened by British policies that prioritised exports over local needs. In China, opium addiction tore communities apart. In Africa, explorers and traders prepared the ground for a wave of colonization yet to come. The Victorian Empire looked confident and unstoppable, but its foundations were not as solid as they appeared. By the end of the 19th century, Britain's empire was at its height. The Union Jack flew over Canada, the Caribbean, India, Australia, New Zealand, Hong Kong, and vast parts of Africa. The phrase, "the sun never sets on the British Empire," had become literal truth. But already, new challenges were emerging. Industrial powers like Germany, the United States, and Japan were rising fast, and nationalist movements were beginning to stir within the colonies. For now, though, Britain basked in its global supremacy. Steam, steel, and empire had created a system that seemed unbreakable. But the 20th century would test whether this vast imperial machine could survive the strains of modernity, nationalism, and war. If the 19th century belonged to Britain in Asia, the late 1800s belonged to Britain in Africa. Until the 1870s, Britain's presence on the continent was limited mainly to coastal trading posts, strategic ports like Cape Colony, and a handful of missionary stations. But in just a few decades, Africa would be carved up like a pie, and Britain would claim the largest slice. The scramble for Africa was one of the most dramatic land grabs in history. European powers, fueled by industrialization and nationalism, suddenly realized Africa was rich in resources: gold, diamonds, copper, ivory, and fertile farmland. At the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, European leaders literally drew borders on maps, dividing the continent with little regard for the people who actually lived there. Britain walked away with an enormous share, stretching from Egypt in the north to South Africa in the south. Key to Britain's African ambitions was the dream of a Cape to Cairo railway, championed by the flamboyant imperialist Cecil Rhodes. Rhodes, a businessman and politician, believed the British were destined to rule Africa. His British South Africa Company acquired vast territories, today's Zimbabwe and Zambia, through treaties, manipulation, and, when necessary, brute force. For Rhodes and others, Africa was a playground of wealth and power, and Britain's flag kept spreading further inland. The jewel in Britain's African strategy was Egypt, especially after the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869. This narrow waterway connected the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, slashing travel time to India. Protecting the canal became a top priority. In 1882, after a nationalist uprising threatened European interests, Britain invaded and occupied Egypt. Though Egypt remained technically part of the Ottoman Empire, in reality it became a British protectorate, ensuring safe passage to India for decades to come. But perhaps the most dramatic and bloody episodes of Britain's African expansion were in South Africa. When diamonds were discovered in Kimberley in 1867 and gold in the Witwatersrand Rand in 1886, South Africa became one of the richest regions on Earth. But wealth brought conflict. The British had long controlled the Cape Colony, while Dutch settlers, known as Boers or Afrikaners, had moved inland to form their own republics, the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. Relations between the Boers and the British were tense from the start. The Boers resented British interference, while the British saw Boer independence as an obstacle to uniting Southern Africa under their rule. Tensions boiled over into the Boer Wars. The First Boer War, 1880 to 1881, was a shock for Britain. The Boers, skilled fighters with intimate knowledge of the terrain, managed to defeat the British in several battles. Britain was forced to recognise Boer independence, a rare humiliation for the empire, but the discovery of gold and diamonds in Boer territory made conflict inevitable. The Second Boer War, 1899 to 1902, was far larger and bloodier. This time, Britain poured in hundreds of thousands of troops from across the empire, including contingents from Canada, Australia, and India. The Boers fought back fiercely with guerrilla tactics, forcing the British into a brutal counterinsurgency. The war ended in 1902 with British victory, and the Boer republics were absorbed into the empire. But the cost was immense, financially, morally, and politically. The brutality of Britain's tactics sparked outrage around the world and raised uncomfortable questions about the civilizing mission that imperialists claimed to uphold. Despite the controversy, the Boer War marked a turning point. Thank you for watching part 1 of my video. Join me next Thursday for the final part of this 2-part series. Please like, subscribe, and share my channel with your friends and family. You can also click on the bell icon to be notified when I post new videos.